There are moments in life that seem insignificant when they happen. A choice, a glance, a stranger on the side of the road. Most people never realize they're standing at the edge of a cliff until it's too late. Because the most dangerous stories don't begin with gunshots. They begin with ordinary people making ordinary decisions. And on a cold, rain-soaked night, Naomi Carter made a decision that would destroy everything she thought she knew. Everything. Her family, her future, her fiancé, and even her understanding of right and wrong. Some people believed Alexander Moretti was a monster. Others believed he was the victim. Some said Naomi Carter was a hero. Others claimed she was manipulated from the very beginning. But everyone agreed on one thing. If Naomi had simply kept driving that night, none of it would have happened. Because lying unconscious beside a deserted road, covered in blood, was one of the most feared men in the country. A man whose name inspired loyalty in some people and terror in others. Alexander Moretti, a billionaire, a businessman, a criminal, depending on who you asked. And by sunrise, his fate would be in Naomi Carter's hands. What Naomi didn't know was that Alexander Moretti wasn't the biggest threat in her life. The real danger was already sitting at her family's dinner table. And before the story ends, you'll discover why the man everyone trusted most was hiding the darkest secret of all. Before Naomi Carter unknowingly stepped into a war she was never supposed to see. Because that night, someone wanted Alexander Moretti dead, and the person was far closer than anyone could imagine. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Traffic moved slowly beyond the skyline. 3 black SUVs raced through the darkness. Inside one of them sat Alexander Moretti, 36 years old, worth billions, surrounded by armed security. A man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, every negotiation, every outcome. Yet despite the wealth, despite the power, despite the army of protection surrounding him, Alexander couldn't shake a feeling. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The problem with surviving for years in dangerous circles is that eventually your instincts become sharper than facts. Your body notices danger before your mind understands it. And Alexander's instincts were screaming. Every mile they traveled, the feeling grew stronger, closer, heavier, as though an invisible shadow was moving alongside the convoy, waiting, watching. Then, it happened. A flash of headlights, a truck appearing from nowhere, an explosion of gunfire. And suddenly the night erupted into chaos. Windows shattered, metal screamed, bullets tore through steel. The lead SUV spun violently across the road. The second vehicle crashed into a barrier. Men shouted, weapons fired, tires exploded. For several terrifying seconds, the entire world became noise, violence, confusion. Then came the bullet that changed everything. It tore through Alexander's shoulder. A second struck his side. Pain exploded through his body. His vision blurred. Blood soaked his suit. And as the vehicle rolled into darkness, Alexander Moretti experienced something he hadn't felt in years. Fear and a mixed feeling of survival. Because for the first time, he wasn't certain he would survive. And somewhere in the distance, through rain and darkness, someone was making sure of that. Someone who desperately needed Alexander Moretti dead. The question was, why? Some secrets stay buried for years, until one small event begins digging them back up. And Naomi Carter was about to pick up the shovel. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Naomi finished her shift. She was driving through the storm. She noticed something near the roadside. At first she thought it was debris. Then she saw movement. A hand, barely visible, reaching weakly toward the road. Most people would have kept driving. And honestly, nobody could blame them. The area was isolated. The weather was terrible, and stopping could be dangerous. But Naomi Carter wasn't most people. She stopped, and that decision changed everything. As she approached, her heart began pounding. There was blood everywhere. A man lay unconscious near the wreckage. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Death was getting closer with every passing minute. Naomi immediately switched into nurse mode. Assess, stabilize, act. No hesitation, no panic, no fear, just action. She tore strips from a blanket inside her car, applied pressure to the wounds, checked his airway, monitored his pulse, doing everything possible to keep him alive. Rain poured around them. Thunder echoed through the darkness. Minutes felt like hours. Then suddenly, headlights appeared. Three armed men rushed from a damaged SUV hidden farther down the road. The surviving members of Alexander Moretti's security team. Their weapons were drawn at first, until they saw Naomi kneeling beside him, trying desperately to save his life. One of the guards dropped to his knees beside Alexander. "Boss!" They screamed, but he was too weak to answer. Naomi quickly explained his condition. The blood loss, the wounds, the immediate dangers. The guards listened carefully, because they knew something terrifying. Alexander Moretti didn't trust hospitals. Not after years of enemies trying to reach him. Not after multiple assassination attempts. One of the guards nodded. "We'll take him from here." Naomi hesitated. Everything inside her told her the man needed advanced medical care. But she also knew she had already done everything possible within her limit else. He would already be dead. The guards carefully lifted Alexander into their vehicle. And as they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Alexander's eyes opened briefly. Only for a second. Just long enough to see her face. Just long enough to remember the woman standing in the rain. The woman who had chosen not to abandon him. Then darkness took him again, and the convoy disappeared into the storm. Naomi stood alone by the roadside, certain she would never see the man again. She was wrong. Very wrong. Alexander Moretti spent the next several days recovering inside his heavily guarded mansion. His personal physician worked around the clock, removing bullets, stopping internal bleeding, fighting infection, keeping him alive. The official story was simple. A violent attack. A miraculous survival. Case closed. But Alexander couldn't stop thinking about one thing. The nurse. The woman from the roadside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Rain falling around her. Blood on her hands. Fearless despite the danger. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care who he was. She simply saved a stranger. And that haunted him in ways he couldn't explain. One evening, while recovering inside his office home, Alexander looked toward his security chief. "Find her." The guard frowned. "The nurse." Alexander nodded. "The woman who treated me." The order surprised everyone. Alexander rarely showed interest in anyone, especially strangers. Yet something about Naomi Carter refused to leave his mind. Days later, the guards returned with a file. Name, Naomi Carter. Occupation, registered nurse. Family, Michael Carter, retired police officer. Relationship status, engaged to Ethan Brooks. Alexander stared at the photograph attached to the report. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he looked again, and again. Something inside him shifted. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps ever. Because for the first time, Alexander Moretti wasn't thinking about business, or enemies, or survival. He was thinking about Naomi Carter. The room fell silent. Alexander Moretti stared at Naomi Carter's photograph. His guards had spent days gathering information. Everything about her was now laid out before him. Her career, her family, her history, her fiancé, and most importantly, her loyalty. The security chief cleared his throat. "Boss, there's something else." Alexander didn't look up. "What?" "She's engaged." For the first time, Alexander's expression hardened. The guard continued. "Ethan Brooks. They've been together for years. The wedding is already being discussed by both families." Silence. A dangerous silence. The kind that made experienced men nervous. Alexander studied the photograph again. The same eyes that had looked down at him in the rain. The same woman who had saved his life without knowing his name. Without asking for anything in return. Finally, he spoke. "Cancel the meeting." The guards exchanged confused glances. "Sir," I said, "cancel it." The order wasn't related to business. It wasn't related to money. It wasn't related to enemies. For perhaps the first time in years, Alexander Moretti was making a decision based entirely on emotion. And emotions were often more dangerous than bullets. The security chief hesitated, then carefully asked the question nobody else dared to ask. "What exactly do you intend to do about Naomi Carter?" Alexander slowly closed the file. His eyes never left her photograph. "I'm going to marry her." The room froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because every man in that office understood the problem. Naomi Carter didn't love Alexander Moretti. She barely knew he existed. And she was already engaged to someone else. The security chief finally found his voice. "Sir, that's impossible." Alexander looked at him. A cold smile appeared. "Nothing is impossible." Days passed, and the obsession grew. The more Alexander learned about Naomi, the more determined he became. Yet one obstacle remained. Michael Carter and Ethan Brooks. Naomi's father was a respected former police officer, a man who would never willingly allow his daughter anywhere near Alexander Moretti, which meant Michael Carter had to be removed from the equation, not permanently, but effectively. Then Alexander learned something interesting. Years earlier, during a corruption investigation, evidence had disappeared. No one was ever charged. No one was ever proven guilty. The case remained unresolved, a forgotten scandal buried beneath years of newer headlines. For most people, it meant nothing. For Alexander, it looked like an opportunity, a dangerous opportunity, one he knew he shouldn't take. Yet the thought refused to leave his mind. If Michael Carter became the focus of a criminal investigation, if his reputation collapsed, if Naomi found herself isolated and vulnerable, then perhaps she would eventually turn toward the one man powerful enough to help her. Alexander stood at the window overlooking the city. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he made a decision. The kind of decision that changes lives. The kind of decision that can never be undone. Because somewhere between gratitude and obsession, Alexander Moretti had crossed a line, and he was no longer asking whether he should have Naomi Carter. He was asking what he was willing to sacrifice to get her. The frightening answer was almost anything. A week later, Alexander Moretti made a decision. He wasn't content learning about Naomi from reports. He wanted to meet her properly. So one afternoon, he arrived at the Carter residence. Not alone. A convoy of luxury vehicles pulled into the neighborhood. Security personnel stepped out first. Then Alexander himself. The entire street seemed to stop and stare. Inside the house, Michael Carter's expression darkened immediately. The moment he saw Alexander standing at his doorstep, old anger returned. Old grief. Old hatred. Because for years, Michael believed one thing. Alexander Moretti was responsible for Noah's death, and nothing could convince him otherwise. You have some nerve showing up here. Michael's voice was ice cold. Alexander remained calm. I came to thank your daughter. You can leave. Michael stepped forward. You aren't welcome here. Neither man backed down. Neither man blinked. And standing between them, Naomi felt the tension, the history, the pain. Eventually Alexander left. But before getting into his vehicle, he looked toward Naomi. For several seconds, their eyes met, and something passed between them, something neither understood. From that day forward, Alexander found excuses to be near her. When the hospital needed new equipment, an anonymous donation appeared. Millions of dollars worth of life-saving machines. When a children's wing required renovations, a mysterious benefactor funded everything. Nobody knew who was responsible, except Naomi. She knew, and she wasn't impressed. Then came flowers, expensive jewelry, rare gifts, each one more extravagant than the last. Diamonds, designer handbags, luxury vacations. Every gift returned unopened, every gesture rejected, because Naomi Carter refused to become another person impressed by wealth. And strangely, that only made Alexander admire her more. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks was panicking. Everywhere he looked, Alexander Moretti seemed closer to Naomi, closer to the truth, closer to everything Ethan had spent years hiding. Fear began turning into desperation, which was why Ethan suddenly proposed moving the wedding date forward. Immediately. No delays, no waiting, no discussion. The wedding would happen within weeks. And Naomi, confused by the urgency, eventually agreed. The church was packed. Family, friends, guests, everyone smiling, everyone celebrating, everyone except one man. Because as Naomi prepared to say her vows, the church doors suddenly opened. A gasp spread through the room. Alexander Moretti had arrived. The entire building fell silent. Slowly, he walked down the aisle, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the stares, ignoring the outrage, until he stood directly before Ethan Brooks. You can't marry her. The words echoed through the church. Shock spread across every face. Ethan clenched his jaw. You've lost your mind. Perhaps. But Alexander continued anyway. Then he did something nobody expected. He offered Ethan a fortune, millions of dollars. Enough money to change multiple lifetimes. The room exploded with whispers. Guests stared in disbelief. Then came an even greater shock. Ethan's own mother stood up, her eyes fixed on the money, her voice trembling. Take it. The church froze. Mom, take the money. Years of greed flashed across her face. Years of hidden ambition. For a moment, everyone expected Ethan to agree. But he didn't. Because despite all his lies, despite all his secrets, Ethan understood one thing. If he lost Naomi, he lost everything. And so he refused. What happened next would haunt everyone involved. Because Alexander refused to walk away just like that. Weeks later, Michael Carter became the target of a criminal investigation. Old evidence resurfaced. Old accusations returned. New charges appeared. His reputation collapsed almost overnight. The respected police officer suddenly found himself fighting for his freedom, fighting for his name, fighting for his future. And with her father facing ruin, Naomi's world began falling apart, one piece at a time. The pressure became unbearable. The investigation, the public humiliation, the endless legal battles. Eventually, Michael made a heartbreaking choice. A choice he believed would protect his daughter. A choice he would later regret. He gave his blessing. And not long afterward, Naomi Carter became Naomi Moretti. But it wasn't a love story. Not yet. Because Naomi didn't trust Alexander. Then came their first night as husband and wife. Naomi sat quietly inside the enormous bedroom. Nervous. Confused. Uncertain about what would happen next. She expected Alexander to approach her. Expected demands. Expected control. Expected the behavior everyone warned her about. Instead, Alexander simply removed his jacket, walked toward the balcony, and stared out at the city lights. Minutes passed, then hours. He never touched her, never approached her, never even looked in her direction. Finally, Naomi spoke. "Why did you marry me?" Alexander remained silent. The question lingered in the darkness, unanswered, because the truth was far more complicated than either of them realized. He hadn't married her because he owned her. He hadn't married her because he conquered her. He married her because somewhere between gratitude, obsession, guilt, and love, he had lost control of his own heart, and he was beginning to fear the consequences. Neither of them knew it yet. Marriage changed many things, but not in the way people expected. Naomi Carter became Naomi Moretti, yet the distance between them remained. The enormous mansion felt more like a hotel than a home. They shared hallways, shared meals, shared silence, but very little else. And strangely, Alexander never complained, because every morning when he saw Naomi, he felt something he couldn't explain, something unfamiliar, something that made him happier than closing billion-dollar deals. The problem was, Alexander Moretti had spent his entire life learning how to negotiate, how to fight, how to win. He had never learned how to love. Business was easy. Emotions were difficult. So instead of expressing his feelings, he buried them, the same way he always had. But for the first time in years, something inside him began to change. Because Naomi made him want to become someone better, someone worthy of her. Slowly, Alexander began shutting down questionable business operations, ending dangerous partnerships, walking away from deals that once made him rich. His advisors thought he was losing his mind. His enemies thought he was becoming weak. The truth was much simpler. For the first time, Alexander Moretti was thinking about the kind of man he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks was unraveling. Losing Naomi had destroyed him. Watching her become Naomi Moretti had shattered whatever remained of his self-control. One afternoon, he walked into the hospital where Naomi worked, ignoring the shocked nurses, ignoring security, ignoring common sense. He found her reviewing patient charts. "Naomi," he called her. She immediately froze. "Ethan," his eyes filled with desperation. "I still love you." Naomi closed the file in her hands. "Ethan, stop," she replied. "You belong with me." He said, "No." Her voice was firm, clear, certain. "I'm married now." The words struck him like a knife. For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Then his face darkened, not with sadness, with anger, pure anger. Because Ethan Brooks was not a man who handled rejection well. He left the hospital that day furious. And for the first time, he stopped blaming Alexander. Instead, he blamed Michael Carter. Because days earlier, Naomi's father had looked him directly in the eye and said, "Find someone else. Leave my daughter alone." The humiliation never left him. Now, he wanted revenge. The next morning, Michael Carter never saw the vehicle coming. A black SUV sped through an intersection, directly toward him. The impact was devastating. Metal twisted. Glass exploded. The world disappeared into darkness. But Ethan made one critical mistake. Michael survived. When Michael regained consciousness inside the hospital, his memory returned slowly, piece by piece. Then all at once, the vehicle, the driver, the face behind the wheel, Ethan Brooks. The news reached Alexander within hours, and something inside him snapped. Immediately, he ordered a full investigation. Every financial record, every communication, every hidden account, every secret. No limits. Alexander wanted everything. And what his investigators discovered changed everything. Because the evidence pointed to one horrifying truth. Ethan Brooks wasn't just responsible for the attack on Michael Carter. He was responsible for Noah Carter's death. For years, the real killer had been hiding in plain sight. Later that afternoon, Alexander arrived at the hospital. To his surprise, Ethan was already there, standing beside Naomi, pretending to be concerned and innocent, pretending to be family. But the performance didn't last long, because Michael Carter opened his eyes, looked directly at Ethan, and spoke. It was him. The room fell silent. Michael pointed toward Ethan. He tried to kill me. Panic flashed across Ethan's face. Then came the second blow. Alexander stepped forward. His investigators handed over folders, photographs, bank records, evidence connecting Ethan to Noah's death, evidence connecting Ethan to years of lies. The truth could no longer hide. Within minutes, police officers entered the room, and Ethan Brooks was led away in handcuffs, screaming. But nobody believed him anymore. The truth had finally won. That evening, Alexander stood alone on the mansion balcony, watching the city lights. Naomi approached quietly. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. You should leave. Naomi looked confused. What? You don't love me. His voice was calm, painfully calm. If staying here makes you unhappy, go. Naomi stared at him. You want a divorce? Alexander smiled sadly. I want you to be happy. The words shocked her, because they were the most honest words he had ever spoken. If you come back, he continued, I'll be here. And if I don't, she replied. Alexander looked toward the horizon. Then I'll know I finally did one thing right. The next morning, Naomi left. With no goodbye, she simply went home to stay with her father. And for the first time since their marriage, Alexander prepared himself to lose her. Forever. Days passed, then a week. And something unexpected happened. Naomi couldn't stop thinking about him. Not the billionaire. Not the feared businessman. Not the powerful Alexander Moretti everyone else saw. She kept remembering the man who sat beside her father's hospital bed. The man who exposed Noah's killer. The man who let her go when he could have forced her to stay. The man who was trying every day to become better. For her. And perhaps, for himself. Only then did Naomi realize something important. Somewhere along the way, she had fallen in love with him too. 1 week later, Alexander heard a knock at the mansion door. He wasn't expecting visitors. When he opened it, his breath caught. Naomi stood there, smiling softly. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Alexander finally asked, Why did you come back? Naomi stepped closer, tears shining in her eyes. Because home is wherever you are. For the first time in years, Alexander Moretti had no words, no strategy, no business plan. No defense, only emotion, real emotion. And when Naomi wrapped her arms around him, he finally understood something money could never buy. Love. The man who once ruled through fear learned compassion. The woman who once hated him learned the truth. The family torn apart by lies finally found peace. And Noah Carter, at last, received justice. Some stories begin with violence. Some begin with tragedy. But the most beautiful endings begin with forgiveness. And this one was finally over. Until next time, remember this. One decision, one secret, one act of kindness can change a life forever. If stories like this keep you thinking long after the end, hit the like button, subscribe for more real-life mysteries where one small moment changes everything.